D23's first time at San Diego Comic-Con with the panel, and we're so excited to be here today. As you can see, as D23 members, we do all tons of events, panels, screenings, all throughout the year and all around the country. So, special shout out to our D23 members in the audience here today. Yay! And I'm sure most of you know us at the D23 Expo, which is going to be next summer, so we'll hope to see you all there as well. But today we have an exciting panel lined up for you, celebrating 90 years of the world's most famous mouse.
Here's our panelist. She has been with the Walt Disney Company for almost 30 years, with the Walt Disney Archives for 25 this summer. Ladies and gentlemen, the maven of minutia, Miss Becky Klein. All right, our second panelist. If you've seen a Disney animated film in the past 35 or so years, you've seen his work. If you like Disney characters, he probably animated your favorite one. So now we have Mark Hinn, Master Animator. All right, and last but not least, the leader of the club himself, the official voice of Mickey Mouse, Mr. Brett Iwan. You guys are awfully close. I'm gonna scoot this way.
Very close.
Yeah.
They said break a leg. I tried.
Walt Disney had a series of silent cartoons in the late 1920s called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and it was very successful, hugely popular, and Walt was a very perfectionist at the time. He always wanted the highest quality, and he always had new ideas for his cartoons. So he went back to New York in 1928 to ask the distributor for more money for the cartoons so that they could make them better. And he got back to New York, and the distributor said, no more money, and by the way, I own the character, so I'm going to take over Oswald. So Walt, didn't freak out. He just took the train back to LA and thought about it the whole trip back and said, I need to come up with a new character, and thought about a little mouse. And when he got back to California, he created a brand new character that we know today as Mickey Mouse.
All right, so what were the first Mickey Mouse cartoons that were created?
Well, the very first Mickey Mouse cartoon that was created was called Plane Crazy, and it was, at that time, the height of popularity right then, the craze going on, was the Lindbergh flights, and so they made a movie based about flying in a plane, and Mickey kind of did his Lindbergh impression. It was a silent cartoon, and they were trying to find a distributor for it and for a second one that they did right after called Gallopin' Gaucho, and he was looking for a distributor and couldn't find one in Los Angeles, and shortly before he lost faith in it, he found out that the Jazz Singer had just opened in Hollywood by Warner Brothers, and it was a smash hit because for the first time there were talkies, there was sound to these cartoons, and he thought, well, that's a great idea, and so he went that direction and created a cartoon called Steamboat Willie that had sound.
All right, so now that we're on to sound, Brett, tell us a little bit about that. That's your area of expertise.
I pretend it is, at least.
Okay.
First off, hello, Comic-Con! I know I can't get away without talking to you guys like that first. Nobody wants to hear this. Sound, yeah, so Steamboat Willie was huge for Mickey because it was the first synchronized sound cartoon, so it was a big deal back then. And Becky and I were just talking on our own train ride down that, back then at the studio at the Hyperion lot, they had projected Steamboat Willie up onto a sheet. And behind the sheet, Walt and the guys stood back there with pots and pans and were making all kinds of sound effects, synchronizing to the sound to test it.
To see if it would work.
To see if it would work, and then they were thrilled. Yeah. So then they went on to New York, right, to actually record it, because there weren't any real recorded, the technology wasn't really around Los Angeles.
To do the recording.
To do the recording.
In LA, so they went.
Yeah, so they went to New York, and then they premiered at the Colony Theater. So yeah, Steamboat Willie was huge.
So Mickey doesn't say a lot in the cartoon.
No.
He makes some grunts and
other
noises.
A lot of grunts and noises. And,
who provided that?
Walt, actually. Walt was the first official voice of Mickey Mouse. So
he also did Minnie's voice in that too.
Ooh.
It's technicality, Becky, but yes.
Little screams here and there.
Tell us a little bit about, Walt wasn't the only one involved in Steamboat Willie. There was actually somebody who did the drawing.
Yes, that would have been Ub Iwerks, and he was the machine, an actual physical artist machine behind these shorts, because he was incredibly prolific and could just bang out this animation left and right. So he was kind of Walt's unsung right-hand man for most of these early shorts.
Great. So, Steamboat Willie premieres. Mickey becomes a huge sensation. Everybody goes out to see it, and they quickly put into production quite a few more films. By 1929, Mickey had learned to speak. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, he did. 1929, Carnival Kid premieres, which was the 9th short, right? And he uttered his first words. Does anyone know this? Hot dog. It was just National Hot Dog Day, so somewhat appropriate.
And isn't that where the hot dog dance comes from?
That is not where the hot dog dance comes from, despite what you might think. Don't make me sing it. Mickey doesn't sing the hot dog dance. Anyway, I digress.
He can do it really well.
He can do it really well. Hot dog, hot diggity dog.
I meant the dance, but...
Oh,
yeah.
I'm not dancing today.
Okay. All right, so let's take a quick look at Mickey's first words on screen.
Hot dog, hot dog. Hot dog, hot dog.
I take it back. That may be where the hot dog dance comes from.
Okay, there you go. All right, Mickey was sort of an extension of Walt's personality, and do you guys have anything on that, how that sort of happened, or?
Well, he also thought of him, he was a big fan of Chaplin.
Right.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, Mickey was kind of his version or incarnation of the Chaplin, the little tramp character.
Yeah.
Walt often said that Mickey was his alter ego.
Yeah. I guess Brett's the only person who can say that now, but anyhow. All right, so Becky, after this point, Mickey became incredibly popular across the world, not just the country. There's Walt with some of the early Charlotte Clark dolls. Tell us about how those happened.
Well, Mickey was instantly popular. The day he premiered, he was an overnight sensation, literally. And so right away, people were, wishing that they could have, their own Mickey to take home. And so a seamstress who lived in Burbank, California, named Charlotte Clark, started making these plush dolls from scratch. She would hand sew all of these dolls. And so she brought a pair of Mickey and Minnie dolls to Walt Disney at the studio as a gift, and he loved them. And they had just gotten into character merchandising at that time. They had just barely scratched the surface. And Walt said, we've got to make these dolls and sell them. And so he set Charlotte up with a house near the studio. He rented a little house, they called it the Doll House, and got her some seamstresses to come and help her. And she started cranking out these handmade Charlotte Clark plush dolls. And they were so popular that she couldn't keep up with the demand. And so she finally came up with a pattern for McCall's, and McCall's did a printed pattern so you could make your own Mickey Mouse plush dolls.
We have one in the archives, right?
We do. We have one in the archives. It's very rare. And you could still make your own dolls from it, but it was a very, very popular thing. And then, of course, they got into manufacturing, and a company called Knickerbocker started making them and mass producing them, the dolls.
So there must have been a lot of merchandise being sold during that time period.
A great deal of merchandise, all kinds of things. The late 20s, early 30s is when it really started booming, and things like the Ingersoll watches and the talk ejectors and the metal toys. They did tin toys, they did radios and telephones and all kinds. Everything you can imagine was mass-produced in the 1930s, became very, very popular.
So that all seems pretty run-of-the-mill, stuff that we sell today. Show me some weird stuff, Becky. She's known for her weird Disney presents.
Yeah, I've been collecting weird Disney images for years now. And one of my favorite things is the merchandise catalog. So as they created this merchandise program, they started selling the merchandise catalogs. And a guy named Kay Kamen was hired by Walt to do this licensing. And so he would release these catalogs. And they have some interesting photos in them.
Yeah, some cool stuff. Well, I mean,
Mickey Mouse undies.
that's pretty normal. We probably still sell those, right?
Mickey Mouse undies were fun. Some of my favorite ones, most of you probably don't remember, but back in the old days, you had cloth diapers for babies, and then you would put a pair of plastic pants over the cloth diaper and they made Mickey Mouse shaped. They had little buttons on them and everything, and little plastic pants to put over. Ooh la la! Ooh, I know. Pretty funny. So there was Mickey Mouse undies, of course. There were also pocket knives. I don't know that this is something that we would currently sell.
I haven't seen them in a while.
Probably not, but they were very popular in the early 30s. Also the costumes, of course, everybody loves costumes and things, and here at Comic-Con I've seen a lot of interesting ones, but these are pretty terrifying if you take a look at them. They're really out there, yeah. These masks were incredibly popular, especially in Europe, because the ladies would wear them to cover their complexion. So I have found photos of these ladies laying out on the beach with these masks on to protect their skin from the elements. And
I have one for the beach tomorrow.
Oh, good. I can't wait to see it.
All right, so Mark, during this time period, Mickey was in a lot of shorts, and his look was sort of developing, and things were sort of changing by 1935. Some things happened.
Well, as you've probably all heard, and it's largely true, Mickey in his early days when Ub was starting to animate him, basically a lot of nickels and dimes and quarters were used around the studio because that was about the size and would give you the nice perfect circles that made up Mickey's body. So his head and his body were largely the same, size circle with a couple smaller circles, dimes on top of the quarters, and then a little connection in between. And there wasn't in the early animation a lot of what we call flexibility or squash and stretch. But as the artists over that time were expanding and learning their craft, Mickey started to kind of loosen up. And as you look at a lot of these shorts, it's pretty amazing to see from 1928 to even, where they were in just 10 years to what they came out with Snow White. Mickey followed that same evolution of animation, and you start to see a little more flexibility. And each animator that worked on Mickey kind of, explored and expanded and just tried to push the bounds of what they could do with the mouse.
Who are some of those animators?
Well, you've got people, largely Ub Iwerks starting it, and then that gave way to an animator by the name of Freddie Moore, who was just this natural. He just kind of walked in off the street, and Walt looked at his sketches and said, "You're hired." And Freddie had just a real natural rhythm and flow to his drawings, what we call Disney appeal. He was kind of the father of Disney animation appeal. And so this is Freddie on the picture there at his drawing desk. But he was largely credited with taking those circles and dimes, very rigid shapes, and loosening it up. He kind of took the body and created what we call a pear shape, which is, kind of narrow and then a little wider around the tummy and the bottom. And, that started to give a lot more flexibility to the animation. And of course, that got Walt all excited because he was always looking for ways of improving. And it gave the animators the opportunity to be much more expressive. And one of the clips you showed from The Brave Little Tailor had a milestone moment. There's a great little scene that Freddie animated where Mickey has finally been, shut out of the castle. Everybody's like going, "Gray, you're gonna go, kill the giant," and Mickey's like, "Oh boy," and it's just like Mickey at his height of emotion and acting, and that was Freddie Moore. And he couldn't have done that unless the body was, softer and a lot more malleable. And that was the kind of things that Mickey started, or that Freddie and other animators brought to it. Les Clark was another early animator who really advanced Mickey's animation.
Awesome. So by 1940, we had a pretty big milestone for Mickey. Becky, can you tell us a little bit about why Fantasia was such a big deal for Mickey?
Well, Fantasia started out as a short. It was going to be a short called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and it was a vehicle that Walt wanted to experiment with classical music, and there was a poem, or a tone poem, by Paul Dukas, which had a story to it already of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and it had a story. So Walt took that, and he was originally going to cast Dopey in it. Snow White came out in 1937, and they were working on this in the late 30s. And he was going to cast Dopey, and he thought, no, I'd rather put Mickey in it. And so they came up with the idea to have Mickey as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And then, of course, they met with Stokowski, who got very excited about this idea, Leopold Stokowski, and turned it into a feature-length film with all these different segments that had different themes and styles. But the most, memorable part of Fantasia has always been the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and it became, a very famous costume and look for Mickey was with the hat. I see hats right out here in the audience. I see people wearing Mickey sorcerer caps. So it was Mickey's big break. It was his first big feature, and of course he was already a superstar. But I think that really sealed the deal for him.
And of course, another physical evolution. This was the first that Mickey actually had the pupilled eyes. I think there was maybe another short that had been in the works prior to that they were experimenting with it, but this was the first time that we saw Mickey with the pupilled eyes that we now know are very familiar with.
It was post-LASIK Mickey. In the 1950s, Mickey had changed again. He sort of took on his mid-century look, we might say. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there were, as I said, Mickey's the kind of a character that is very open to the artists that work with him. And so as, styles, artistic sensibilities changed, the studio and the artists there, Mickey's design changed as well. And I think there was, Walt used to kind of refer to him, he said, he kind of looked like a little man now. He kind of lost some of the early proportions that he used to have. But largely, it kind of reflects the style that was very popular in those days. And what you're seeing here is, I think it's a model sheet, how to draw Mickey that you could have gotten at the parks at that time. But if you look really closely, it's got a little more of a stylization to it, a little more of an edge in some respects. And that, again, was really just reflecting the sensibilities and the style that was very popular in the 50s.
So speaking of the 50s, Mickey he was busy. He slowed down on the shorts business by about 1953. But what was he doing, Becky?
Well, Walt discovered something really interesting. It was called television. And he decided that he was going to do a children's show. It was partly to raise money to build Disneyland. He got into a deal with ABC, and as part of the deal, they said, we want you to produce a weekly or a daily television show for kids. And so Walt said, well, I'm going to take Mickey, because everybody loves Mickey, and created the Mickey Mouse Club. And so the 1950s Mickey Mouse Club happened about that time. So Walt put Mickey in as the host of that show. And so while Donald and the other characters were making the shorts, Mickey was hosting the Mickey Mouse Club. And then, of course, Disneyland opened the same year, and so Mickey was pretty busy. Well, the Mickey Mouse Club started out, it only ran for 3 full seasons, 1-hour episodes of it every day, so there was a lot of the shows. But it starred, of course, some very talented youngsters that were cast in the show, and some famous ones came out of there. I'm sure you've all heard of Annette Funicello. Annette.
Maybe you don't know your stuff, Brett.
Yes. Bobby Burgess and Darlene Gillespie and folks like that. So they're very, very popular. The show was immensely popular with kids in the 50s. And of course, Jimmy Dodd, who you see there, it was the Big Mouseketeer, and he was the host of the show, and he played the mouse guitar. And you're very famous for wearing mouse ears. And the mouse ears actually were really interesting. They needed some kind of uniform to bring these kids together for the show, and so Roy Williams, who was an animator at Disney and was the big Mooseketeer, they called him. He was the big guy, and he was also a very talented animator, and so he remembered a cartoon short. I think it was actually Carnival Kid, where Mickey tips his ears to Minnie.
And he pulls them off
and
completely.
The top of his head comes off as if it was a hat. And Roy, of course, was the master of gags, and so he thought that was pretty funny, and so he came up with this idea of, as he put it, he took a yarmulke and put ears on it, and became very famous on the Mickey Mouse Club, and then, of course, they started selling them at the theme parks and at Disneyland.
So the theme parks, let's talk about that.
The parks, yes, of course.
Segway.
Mickey was also a host at the parks.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was also sort of the beginnings of the parks in some ways.
Yeah, the reason that Walt said he started Disneyland, he had several different reasons. He wanted to have a place where families could go together and enjoy their time. But he also was getting inundated with fan letters from little kids who wanted to know, they wanted to come to the studio and see where Mickey Mouse lived. And, he thought, well, maybe I should build a little park next to the studio. And so he came up with this idea for a Mickey Mouse park. And so Disneyland was at first it was going to be about Mickey Mouse, and then Walt started adding in different things, but it was a place where kids could come to see Mickey. And then, of course, he ran out of space really quickly and built in Anaheim. And Mickey was there. Mickey and Donald and Minnie were there at the early years.
Great.
Of a kind there.
It was
yes.
a different time. They were working very hard back then. Life was rough for
But by the 60s, they started looking
the
better.
60s. They changed a little, and you can see they were a little.
Keep improving.
Does this have improvement? Yeah.
And Mickey slimmed up a little bit.
Yes, Mickey did
Didn't
slim
have
up
quite
quite
such
a bit. Yes, by the time they were taking color photos in the late 60s, he had slimmed down quite extensively.
All right, so this brings us to the 60s, and then, by the late 60s, Walt had passed away. But not long after, that sort of helped start the Walt Disney Archives. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Walt Disney passed away in 1966, and at that point, we were losing a lot of animators were retiring, passing away, and we lost Ub Iwerks in 1971. But long about that time, 1970, a young man named Dave Smith, who was a librarian at UCLA, came to Roy Disney, and Roy O. Disney, who was Walt's older brother and the co-founder of the studio, and said, I really think that it would be a good idea for you to take all of your company files and all of the materials that you've produced over the last so many years and put them together into an archive and actually start something. Well, this is a brand new idea. There was no such thing as an entertainment archive at that time. And so Roy hired him to first inventory Walt's offices and then create the archive. So the Walt Disney Archives started in 1970, and it was the very first entertainment archives in the world. And other studios followed suit and started making archives just like we did.
Yeah, so we got to get to the 80s. We're actually behind our decade on our time schedule.
Okay.
But let's first talk about 1978. Mickey's 50th anniversary was coming up, and nobody knew when to celebrate it.
Nobody knew, and so Dave started digging in the archives files, and he found a program from the Colony Theater, and it was dated November 18th, 1928. And so he looked at it and said Steamboat Willie, and that was the very first premiere showing in New York at the Colony Theater. For those of you who know New York well, the Colony Theater is now the Broadway Theater. So you can still go there and visit, but we even know exactly what time Mickey premiered. It was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon before a newsreel and the movie Gang War, which I've always found terribly amusing.
So this November 18th, set your alarms for 2 p.m. Eastern time if you want to celebrate accurately.
Yes, 5 o'clock here on the West Coast.
So there was Mickey's 50th that happened around that time, and of course Disco Mickey Mouse, but that brings us nicely into the 80s. There's a lot of fun Mickey projects during the 80s, like his 60th birthday, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and he got added on the side of the Star Trader at Disneyland. Mark, do you know anything about that?
A little. No, at the time they had opened, in 1989, they had opened the Florida Animation Studio. How many of you have ever been down there? Yeah, great. So they had asked me, they came in one day and asked my boss, they said, we've got this little project and we need an animator to take a look at it, so he gave me a call. And so I actually got to go in and rework and do all the poses, which became that neon sign. So that's my one big contribution to Disneyland I'm kind of proud of. So that's kind of
You've voiced some of Mickey's relatives over the years, haven't you? What's that like?
Oh, riveting.
Riveting, yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. I wish I had a project like The Prince and the Pauper, because I've always admired that, but
Well, Mark's here. Give him some ideas.
Yeah, right.
Take them back
We'll
to
discuss afterwards. But Martian Mickey they just changed my voice on that. Baby Mickey.
Well, my favorite is Count Micula.
Oh, Count Micula. It's not that different, but okay.
All right.
I think my castle's haunted.
We should do a Mickey Rocky Horror one of these days.
That's essentially what that
Now that
cartoon was.
once we own Fox, I think we can.
Oh, all right.
All right, so speaking of baby Mickey, we have some nice baby photos here. The 1990s brought a lot of new Mickey projects, and children of that era, including myself and Brett, as seen on screen here, were inspired by a lot of those projects. What was your favorite during that time period?
That was the early 80s, FYI.
Oh, sorry.
Not the 90s. Anyway, sorry, special projects?
Yeah.
In the 90s, well, there's Fantasmic. Is that what you want me to talk about?
Yes. That's what I'm cueing you for.
Oh, you're queuing me to talk about Fantasmic. Fantasmic premiered, I think, in '92 at Disneyland. And my special story about Fantasmic is, along with Mickey's Christmas Carol and a lot of the classic shorts, Fantasmic was the one show that just was like the epitome of Disney magic for me. I grew up in Southern California, went to Disneyland at least once a year, and the first time I saw Fantasmic just emerge out of nothing, it was like, this is amazing. So I insisted on seeing it every time we went down, and on this one trip, my dad was just too tired to stay for Fantasmic, so we had to go. But on the way out, we passed Mickey's Star Trader, actually, and saw the Fantasmic CD for sale on a rack. And he said, I'll tell you what, we can't stay, but I will buy you the soundtrack. When we get home, we can listen to it. So we drove all the way home, listened to it, and I was so depressed to be listening to the soundtrack instead of seeing it in person, feeling the bass and seeing the pyro. Anyway, that CD is what kind of helped me develop my Mickey voice, because my brother and I would put on our own versions of Fantasmic. We would have lights and put our toys out and play the soundtrack, and that's actually the first time I ever started doing character voices, was I mimicked all the characters, and one time Mickey just kind of seemed right, and I thought, doesn't sound half bad. So Fantasmic is really what I credit as helping me perfect the voice, and then recently, last summer, 2 summers ago, I guess, we enhanced Fantasmic, and I had the chance to re-record, even though I was hesitant to, because I loved having the original Fantasmic as an homage to Wayne and his amazing talent. But they had me re-record it, and I got to go see it. My brother and I watched it together, and at the end of it, he, comes to the final line.
Some imagination, huh?
My brother put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Did you ever think that when we were kids, setting up Fantasmic in our room, that someday you would be on these speakers?" And admittedly, I bawled my eyes out and went running away. It's too emotional for me. But...
All right. So since you got to tell us that story, we're gonna have to speed through the story of how you got hired as being Mickey.
It's boring anyway. So I went to, my dream was always to work for Disney, but as an artist, and I went, that led me to art school. I did not end up at Disney, I ended up at Hallmark Cards in Kansas City, Missouri, of all places, similar to Walt, just blocks away from his Laugh-O-Gram studio, actually. I was there for a while, and then a friend of mine who works at Pixar found out that they were auditioning for an understudy at the time for Mickey Mouse, and she knew I did the Mickey voice and said, "You've got to try out for this." And I just thought, won't that be a cool story to someday say, I auditioned for Mickey Mouse, how cool is that? Little did I know I got a phone call a few months later, and they actually wanted me to come out for an in-studio audition. I did that, and unfortunately Wayne had passed away during that audition process, so it turned from being an understudy to basically assuming the role position. And that is the very concise version of how I got it. You're welcome. The end.
So you sent me a few of your first projects. If we could throw those up.
Okay.
Do we have the keynote? Anyway.
That's just us.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
There we are.
Some of the first things you get to work on.
The joy of this role is that I really get a view of the entire company. I get to work on theme park stuff, TV shows, video games. So there's Sensational Parade, Disney on Ice is always fun. I got to take on the last 2 seasons of Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, and then most recently Mickey and the Roadster Racers is the show we're currently working on.
So this kind of brings us to the more modern, kids are now getting hooked on Mickey through TV and through their phones and through all sorts of different things, and Mickey is now a cross-platform, worldwide sensation with all the different merchandising things and things that are happening. but we're still making some cool cartoons with Mickey.
Absolutely.
Mark worked on something about 5 years ago. That's kind of cool. Wait, was this 5 years ago or the 20s?
Has it been 5 years? I don't know. But it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool. This is called Get a Horse. And yay, get a horse. And this was a really, really interesting challenge. I was in the meeting when Lauren pitched it. She should basically said, I just had this idea about, old-fashioned looking Mickey cartoon, and all of a sudden he just kind of popped through the screen and became, colored and everything. And it was like, yeah, that's a good idea. And so they made the short. It was a challenge that we had to kind of set aside everything that we were trained to do to go back to a 20s style, but it was a lot of fun. We had a really good time with it.
Brett, what are you working on for Mickey's 90th?
I've been working on a lot of stuff that were not what? A lot of stuff in the works. I'm not supposed to talk about a lot of it, but as of today, I can officially announce that I'm very excited to be a part of Kingdom Hearts 3, which will be premiering in January of 2019.
All right, so Becky, how are you celebrating Mickey's 90th?
Well, something very special about Mickey's birthdays is that every major anniversary, the Walt Disney Company has created an official portrait of Mickey. And those portraits are proudly residing in the Walt Disney Archives. John Hench was the first portrait artist. He did a portrait for Mickey's 25th anniversary in 1953, and did one every major anniversary after that until he was 95 years old, and he did the 75th anniversary portrait in 1988. So after that, at the 80th birthday, Paul Felix, who was the art director on Bolt and a very talented animator at Disney, did a special portrait for Mickey's 80th birthday, and this is the 90th birthday coming up this
all
year.
of you who are sitting out there just received a set of magnets of all of those other portraits for you to study. We couldn't leave you without a few surprises. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to announce that the artist that was chosen for the Mickey's 90th 2018 portrait is none other than Mark Henn himself. So, get ready, because we are unveiling it to the world right now. You are the first people outside of Disney and maybe Mark's studio to see the official 90th anniversary Mickey portrait. So without further ado, take it away. So Mark, take it from here. Tell us about how this came together.
Well, I was just kind of wandering around the studio, minding my own business one day. It's actually right around, I think the archives and D23 had that exhibit for Christmas. And I was overlooking at that. And Michael came up and asked me if I'd be interested in doing the portrait for Mickey's 90th. I mean, how do you say no to that? So, as you're seeing, this is in my studio. They came out and set up a time lapse, so we're taking a frame of film every 30 seconds. So it's about 30 hours worth of total work, compacted down to about 2.5 minutes. And but wow, what an honor! I've seen John Hench's portraits, my entire career at Disney, and again, I was just floored to have that opportunity. It was actually an idea I just, as an artist myself, had toyed with the idea of doing a portrait of Mickey just for my own personal pleasure. But this was, this is the cherry on top of the ice cream, for everything to be able to do this. So. Yeah, it's just great. I'm still kind of speechless. I forced myself for the last month or so, once they picked it up from my studio, not to go back over to the archives just to take a peek at it and see if when they got it all framed up. So I think it looks good in the frame.
Well done.
So,
It does, and you can come over anytime and see it.
So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks so much for coming out to this. If you love the portrait, our August issue of Disney 23 magazine, available only to D23 members, will be featuring this very portrait that you were the first to see. So look out for that in your mailbox if you're a member. Thanks everybody.
Thank you guys. Thank you.